Hello and welcome to another episode of Battlefield Breakdown. Today we're gonna be zooming out a bit and talk about war termination. Not only today, this will be a part of a two-part series. In the first part of the series, I'll talk a bit on where we are in the war, where the war will or might be going to, how the war can progress, and in the next episode, we'll talk a bit on what would need to be done to influence the outcome of the war. Because, of course, we are at an important junction in this war. We are roughly, at least to my estimates, in the halftime of the war itself. We have to calculate, or we have to assume that the war will unfortunately last for another 2 to 3 years, but I will later on explain why I assume that. And the outcome of the war as such is not something that is predetermined by now. It can go either way. Ukraine can win or lose. And of course, there are a lot of people speculating about the stalemate or an indecisive outcome. So I will now break down where we are at the war, how we may arrive at either a victory, a defeat, or an indecisive draw. What will be the consequences for the rest of Europe or world politics? What will be the consequences for Ukraine? What will follow from then? And which decisions or which turning points might actually influence the war to go either good or bad? To start from where we are, of course now in a very difficult year of 2024, after having a complete bad year in the first year of the invasion force, where by the end of the year, Russian forces were severely beaten back by 2 successful counteroffensives. Russian forces reconstituted in 2023 and now are again on the offensive. They have roughly doubled the size of the force that is fighting in Ukraine compared to the initial time of the invasion. So there are roughly 520,000 soldiers compared to the 175 to 190,000 soldiers that were involved in the war at the very beginning. They field roughly 3,400 main battle tanks in total, which is of course more than twice the amount of the 1,600 that the Russian armed forces had in active service at the beginning of the invasion, out of which they fielded a bit more than 1,000 in the invasion force as such. And then they field more than 4,500 infantry fighting vehicles and armored personnel carriers in this huge force, and they field more than 5,000 pieces of artillery. All that, of course, is much more than they did at the beginning of the invasion. This large force, unfortunately, is matched or is contained by a Ukrainian force that, although in numbers, of course, has grown significantly since the beginning of the invasion. There was the total mobilization, and of course now we're witnessing a second wave of mobilization. The army grew from roughly 250,000 soldiers to roughly 1 million soldiers in uniform, but the issue on the Ukrainian side is, of course, materiel. If you compare how many main battle tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, so the heavy fighting vehicles, Ukraine got and how many they have certainly lost in the war. I'm talking about, for example, Oryx project photographed identified losses. You can easily see that they haven't fully recovered all these vehicles that they have lost by international assistance. The same is true for other systems, especially if you count the de facto obsolescence in, for example, almost all of the Soviet legacy surface-to-air missile systems. They're still on the Ukrainian rosters, they still have them, but because of the lack of ammunition and spare parts, a lot of weapon systems are out of order. And this, of course, surface-to-air missiles are the most prominent example. Aircraft is actually another one. Both categories apply. First, Ukraine has not recovered fully all its losses during the war. Second, of course, spare parts and ammunition for Soviet-type fighters are hard to find, especially the long-range, beyond visual range air-to-air missiles. The Ukrainian forces, although of course they have increased in numbers, have in their capabilities, especially for maneuver warfare, for air warfare, for air defense, unfortunately decreased their effectiveness over the course of these 2 years of fighting. They could not fully replenish, and that is giving Russia the advantage in the war right now, the numerical superiority, the superiority in fires that they enjoy now to conduct this offensive. Now, will this always be the case? Will Russia be the kind of giant, never shrinking army that always expands? No, that is not the case. We can estimate that Russia now has roughly reached its peak performance. We can see on the stocks of equipment that the Soviet Union built up in decades of their existence, who are being depleted, that at the current rate of consumption and losses, Russia will have dramatic material problems in replenishing, for example, armored personnel carriers in 2025. By the end of 2025, 2026, infantry fighting vehicles will follow roughly of 1 year thereafter. I mean, there are still BMP-1s in storage, but then Russia might even run out of BMP-1s. It's mind-blowing to think of it, especially for us gray-haired Soviet Union watchers, that Russia might ever run out of BMP-1s, but we actually might approach this situation. Our main battle tanks and artillery systems here, Russia can stretch the curve a bit. Main battle tanks, they might run out at the current loss rate in 2028. So things will not always go straight forward for Russia. But of course, the big question is, can Ukraine stay in the fight for that long? Will we have in the West the will to replenish Ukraine for that long? Will we enable Ukraine to be an efficient fighting force by not only just donating something, but making sure that this can be maintained, that there's always enough ammunition, that there are always enough spare parts to have functional, integrally functional units? That is the issue, because this is basically what Russia is resting upon, that it will erode over time, despite the heavy losses, the Ukrainian armed forces' ability to resist the Russians, to organize a well-organized, systematic, cohesive defense. And if we look into the spring of this year, when Ukraine had severe shell shortages because of the delay in US Congress and the inability of Europeans to jump in and give Ukraine the ammunition needed in the quantity that was required, was a warning sign how such a war towards a Russian victory might play out. And if we look into 2025, I'm not openly saying that Trump is the person with whom the war will stand or fall. There are many scenarios we can think of that might impede US assistance. Biden might get reelected, but with an adverse Congress. Trump might be reelected with another domestic contingencies. There are a lot of scenarios we can think about where the military assistance to Ukraine from the US can get caught up in domestic squabbles and domestic political turmoil. And in such a phase, unfortunately, the Europeans once were incapable of backfilling lacking US support. And we, of course, can only guess whether they will be capable of doing so the next time. Saying also that in many critical issues on ammunition, the Europeans, even in theory, don't have the capability to backfill Ukraine's needs without at least having an agreement with the US of buying these weapon systems. Think of Patriots, think of Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. There is no widespread available infantry fighting vehicle at this time in Europe. The Bradley is one of the most effective, not only the most effective infantry fighting vehicle in Ukraine, it's one of the most effective armored fighting vehicles as such in Ukraine. Think of ammunition for HIMARS. The launchers, some launchers have come from Europe, but the ammunition comes from the US. Think of cluster ammunition. Cluster ammunition per round is 8 times more effective than a conventional round, and against special targets like electronic warfare systems, like high-value air defense systems in the Russian rear, where you have a basically GPS-denied environment. The only chance to hit a high-value target is to use cluster ammunition. The problem is, most European countries have signed the cluster ammunition conventions. They're even forbidden to provide this kind of ammunition. It rests on the US. So this is a huge factor of insecurity, I think, and a factor of insecurity that Europeans haven't properly recognized by now. And we will see in the magnitude of US support that will have a crucial outcome for Ukraine. If everything goes bad, of course, Russia may be able to erode Ukraine's ability to organize or to mount an organized, cohesive military defense. And then Russia will occupy the country. It will, of course, mark the end of the interstate war and the beginning of a partisan anti-occupation war. But of course, then Russia has, at least in the interstate phase of the war, won. Russia will then execute its genocidal agenda to wipe out the Ukrainian nation from the face of the earth. We will see widespread refugees coming to Europe. There are 20 million Ukrainians living under governmental control right now. If we apply the ratio of people fleeing to Europe versus staying on the ground from the beginning of 2022, we can at least see 12 millions going to Europe. But I have to say, in the beginning of 2022, the full extent of Russians' genocidal practices in the occupied areas were not as crystal clear to every Ukrainian as they are now. So rather think of 20 millions, or most of them who are then, depending on the situation, are able to escape. They will try to escape. The second thing is you will have a further radicalization of the Russian regime. You will then have their armed forces, their domestic intelligence, their internal security forces, Rosguardia, systematically used for conducting a genocide. These people, if it is not for the continuation of the Russian regime, will face a court in practically every quarter of the earth. These people who have conducted these war crimes, who will have conducted these war crimes, will fight for the survival of Putin's regime, will fight for the survival of the agenda, of the geopolitical agenda, which is hate the West, that has justified their crimes, because otherwise they would also have to reckon with what they have done. And I mean, Russians here are not different from any other humans. If you look into the generation of Germans or Austrians who went to World War II, a lot of them rationalize the lies of Hitler's, and rationalize them even after it became public knowledge and available information that Hitler's reason for the war were just lies. Because otherwise one would have to question why they had done what they had done. And even if they were not SS officers, even if they were just ordinary Wehrmacht officers, being part of a criminal war in itself that has genocidal intent, you can't stay out of the machine. The notion of the kind of innocent fighter is a notion, but it's more self-justification than it was truth. And the same will be the case with the Russians, just on a scale that is truly worrying for us. So it will entrench the Russian regime. It will entrench an anti-Western, offensive, militaristic, expansionist agenda. It will convince Russia that the West is weak. It will convince Russia that the West, although the West is good in economic warfare and good in democracy promotion, they are weak on the military flank. And the military flank is the thing that Russia can throw into the equation to turn the tables of history against the West. And they will try to do that further. Whether they will try it on the first instances, on the second, they will. And in doing so, they will, because they think that the current Ukrainian government is just a Western puppet, they will think that we will support and defend other Western allies just as piecemeally and inconsequentially as we have defended Ukraine. And that might actually persuade Putin to conduct other mistakes, to underestimate resolve, to underestimate capabilities of NATO, and to conduct adventures of aggression he would otherwise not have conducted. These are the consequences of a Ukrainian defeat. So let's move on to the issue of a draw, an indecisive outcome of the war. And I have to say, first, this is a very broad category, because basically we are now talking to a war where basically the Russian offensive machinery, the military machinery that keeps on hammering Ukraine, trying to subdue it, will exhaust its resources at one point, recognizing that unless they're going for a pause, they just can't keep going on. On the other hand, by the time Ukrainian armed forces and Ukrainian society will be so exhausted from the losses, so exhausted from the years and years of war, that they also would welcome a pause and forgo the goal of kicking the Russian out, or will be so worn out that even if they try, can't kick the Russians out. Now, of course, there's a wide variety in this scenario. You can imagine of the kind of Minsk III thing, what Berlin or some of the Washington people are dreaming about, that the current front will hold out for long and long and long, and then there will be a ceasefire. Well, that's a very uncertain guess. We can also guess that maybe Ukraine will get the upper hand later on when the Russians get weaker, but not fully the decisive power to kick the Russians fully out. That will be a bit of a better solution. We could also have an adverse solution where the Russian military potential for offensive exhausts itself somewhere close to the Carpathians, and whatever remains is then very small. I will not go into detail into all of that because that's fishing in very murky water, but there are a lot of problems with this scenario. First of all, it might take years, many more years than I estimated beforehand, before such a stalemate might actually arrive. I told about Russian stocks depleting, but as you might know, Russia has appointed a new Minister of Defense who has extensive contacts to China, and Russians trying to persuade the Chinese to donate not only chemical pre-products, spare parts, computer chips, special machinery, tooling, etc. for the defense and war effort of the Russian military-industrial base, but also to donate or to give or to sell entire vehicles. That's what the Russians want. They don't get it by now, but China might, over the course of the years, change its course. And then what I said about the depletion of stocks might actually be pushed back further years, because if Russia runs on second-hand Chinese stock from leftover Cold War material, that's a lot of stuff. Will we be able and willing to support Ukraine that long? Do we really want to do that? Will Ukraine hold out so long? Because even if Ukraine achieves a good attrition ratio, there is always a Ukrainian that is being attrited for every 3 to 10 Russian, depending on which phase of the war we are talking about, that is taken out of the equation. And by the end, yes, of course, in theory, we can deliver a lot of stuff to Ukraine, but we can't deliver Ukrainians to Ukraine. What kind of country will this be after 5, 7, maybe 10 years of strategic bombardment by the Russians? What then will be still left? The other problem is, after the war, who guarantees this is not just a strategic pause? Who guarantees that Russia will not enter a continuation war once it has, again, sourced all the military equipment to pick up the fight again? Look at the discussions about NATO membership, look at the discussions about bilateral security guarantees, all the baffling about an Israel solution, that's empty hot air. Israel has nuclear weapons. Israel has a totally different environment. Israel has a different genesis and how it fought for its independence and how that came about. Israel's first pick as an enemy was not the Soviet Union. It were some developing Arab states who at the time had a superiority of mass, yes, but not the defense industrial apparatus we are talking about with regard to Russia. Will Ukraine's society keep in the trust of an agreement with Putin, or will they seek to go to the West to be on the secure side? What a economically survivable and sustainable country Ukraine then will be if all investors have the feeling that war will restart in 5 years, and why build a factory now? There is return of investment in most businesses requires 10 to 15 years of continuous businesses. Can you do that in a ceasefire environment? Is NATO willing to send divisions and nuclear weapons to the ground in Ukraine to keep a status quo? Are we? I don't know. Current discussions don't really say we will. Maybe the will come, but for the time being, that's a very shaky proposal. So basically, then we are not talking about war termination. We are talking about stretching the war. The problem is the Chinese military will become bigger. The Taiwan contingency will become not a theoretical war game, but might become a practical contingency in the 2030s, in the 2040s. The People's Liberation Army wants to have the capability to challenge America's global leadership. If then a war in the Pacific breaks out, the Americans will have to send much more equipment, soldiers, capabilities to the Pacific in order to react to that. Will Russia then be capable of an opportunistic attack, not only in Ukraine and Europe? Will a ceasefire? There might well be. That might be their chance they're waiting for. So it's a very unsecure, it's a very hard to predict proposal to go for a Minsk III solution. We should avoid that at any cost, because it's the least controllable. It's not as unfavorable in the consequences as the Ukraine loses scenario, but not by large margins. On the other hand, it's a very expensive scenario too. And it's particularly costly for Ukraine. So let's move to the victory scenario. And that is, of course, creating probably raised eyebrows in much part of the world. How can we think about Ukraine beating Russia? Well, of course, Ukraine can. As I said, the Russian army is not the almighty, never-ending resources wonder machine. If the West keeps pressure on China not to lift certain restrictions on military supplies to Russia, Russia will have its weak phase. Starting from 2026, thereafter, Russia will have problems resupplying its armed forces. If we manage to build up a Ukrainian armed force that is capable of exploiting this kind of scenario, then the tables of war might turn again. Ukraine, of course, has a lot of things to do. Reconstitute forces, retrain them, even the training standards amongst different brigades, because there are now very elite ones and there are less elite ones. But if you want to have maneuvers, if you want to exert pressure on the Russians, you need to have large-scale operations. For large-scale operations, of course, you need to have a much more even training standard and even equipment standard across the board. Ukraine will have to continue with its technical innovation in many fields, employ in mass stuff that it's probing or testing right now, from combat information systems to electronic warfare systems to drones to strike drones. Ukraine will have to improve its situation in the air, recovering air superiority at least partially over parts of the front, pushing back the Russian Air Force, being able to induce losses on the Russian technical apparatus, electronic warfare system, long-range surface-to-air missile, Air Force, on a higher pace. These losses are much harder to replace for Russia than humble tanks, infantry vehicles, and the sort. All that maneuver pressure, economic pressure, maybe there are more effective Western sanctions, maybe there is more pressure on the banking system, more pressure on the energy system that will dwindle the Russian financial resources that are now pawning the war. If all that comes together, and I will longer talk in the next video series on how that comes together and which elements would be needed for that, we may arrive at the situation where the Russian regime, and I'm not talking about Putin personally, because you can remove Putin if you really need to, but the elites, the Russian elites will have to choose between peace and power. And to remind it, in 1917, the Russian elites choose not to make peace and hence not stayed in power. We might be at the situation where the Russian elites are wiser and choose to make peace, not on their wishful thinking, but real peace in order to preserve power. That's something Ukraine can achieve with, of course, better organized, better planned, and more Western support. But it's something that is within reach. What would that entail? It would, of course, crush the image and the self-understanding of Russia as a successful imperial power. It would mark the first truly fought escape from the Soviet Union, once that was defended by military force. The appetite for Russia to repeat this exercise against other post-Soviet states, let alone NATO and Europe, will, of course, diminish. It will cause, even if not immediately, but over the longer course of history, for younger Russians to question whether this was all worth it. And it might harbor the seed of political change inside Russia. I'm not so far that I say that the war can only be won if there's a revolution. that deposes the Putin regime. But I think that the prospect of political change, and I'm saying political change, is something we should embrace as an opportunity and not treat as a mortal risk. That said, I will in the next show explain what steps need to be taken by the West and by Ukraine to make the latter option a reality. Because for the long-term peace and coexistence in Europe, I think it's the only viable, doable, sustainable solution. All the rest would just be a prelude to the next war, one I would love to avoid.